Good afternoon. I'm Hale Esfandiari. I run the Middle East program at the Wilson Center. I would like to welcome you to the center and to today's meeting, Challenges of Chemical Weapons Disarmament in Syria. This meeting is co-sponsored with the Los Alamos National Laboratory. The Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars was established in 1968. It's a non-partisan center which aims to unite the world of ideas with the world of policy by supporting preeminent scholarship and linking that scholarship to issues of concern to officials in Washington. Congress established the center as the official national memorial to President Wilson, and we keep repeating that President Wilson was the only president who had a PhD and he was the president of Princeton University. The Middle East program began in 1998. In addition to spotlighting day-to-day issues, we continue to concentrate on long-term regional developments and their impact on political and social structure, economic development, and relations with the United States. In the last 2 years, the program has paid special attention to the changes that are taking place in the countries of the Arab Spring, and in the last 2 months we have focused on the changes that are taking place in Iran, and in the last 2 days we have focused on the changes that are taking place in the relationship between Iran and the United States. We basically, when we look at the Middle East, and especially when we look at the countries of the Arab Spring, we look at how they have fared after their initial revolutions. To give you an example, we had last week a delegation of former Shura members from Egypt representing a cross-section of the political spectrum, including a representative of the Muslim Brotherhood, who was here as, I think, as the first representative since the second revolution in Egypt. Today's meeting is very topical, and it is chaired by my colleague, Dr. Robert Litvak, who is the Vice President for Scholars and Academic Relations and the former Director of International Security Studies at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Rob is also an adjunct professor at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service and the consultant to the Los Alamos National Laboratory. He served on the National Security Council staff as Director for Non-Proliferation in the first Clinton administration. His most recent books are Rogue States and U.S. Foreign Policy, Containment After the Cold War, and then Regime Change, U.S. Strategy Through the Prism of 9/11. Rob is going to chair the meeting and introduce our speaker, Charles Duelfer, who I believe last spoke here a couple of years ago, so it took quite a long time to get him back here. Before I give the floor to Rob, could I please ask you to turn off your cell phones, because we have live webcast, we have live C-SPAN, and we have Al Jazeera, and your cell phones, if they are not turned off, will interfere with their broadcast. Rob, you have me.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Hale, and welcome to all of you, those here today at the Wilson Center and those watching either on C-SPAN or via live webcast. Today's session could not be more topical, on the challenges of chemical weapons disarmament in Syria. The Security Council of the United Nations is set to vote on a resolution brokered by the United States and Russia to eliminate Syria's stocks of chemical weapons. This action diffuses the crisis triggered by the Assad regime's use of chemical weapons against insurgents in late August and a U.S. threat of military action to prevent further use. U.S. officials say the UN resolution will be binding and enforceable under Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter. To discuss the challenges that lay ahead in achieving chemical weapons disarmament in Syria, we are fortunate to have with us today one of the world's leading authorities on WMD issues. And there's a lot of hyperbole in Washington, but I think that is an accurate kind of description of Charles Duelfer, who spent over 25 years in the national security agencies of the United States government. His experience on Iraq began in the 1980s as Washington considered its role regarding the Iran-Iraq War. In the 1990s, Duelfer was seconded to the United Nations and served as the Deputy Executive Chairman and subsequently Acting Chairman of the United Nations Special Commission on Iraq, UNSCOM. It was from 1993 until 2000. UNSCOM was the original group of UN weapons inspectors in Iraq that was at the friction point between Baghdad and Washington in regular crises until President Clinton ordered a limited bombing in response to Iraq's non-cooperation in 1998. After the 2003 invasion of Iraq and the toppling of the Saddam Hussein regime, Charles Duelfer served as special advisor to the Director of Central Intelligence for Iraq WMD. He led the Iraq Survey Group that conducted the investigation of the scope of Iraq's WMD. The ISG was a unique intelligence organization of over 1,700 military and civilian staff that investigated Iraq WMD programs. It used all of the available collection and analytic capabilities in a hostile environment. The Duelfer Report, as it is now referred to, is the definitive work on the relationship of the Saddam regime to WMD. And I commend that report to you, even though it's historical. It has continuing resonance in dealing with contemporary issues. It's on the CIA website. He authored a superb book, essentially a memoir of his experience in Iraq, titled Hide and Seek, The Search for Truth in Iraq. And in that book, Charles explains what went on not only inside the U.S. government in which he was kind of serving, but also based on the extraordinary interviews that the ISG conducted. He gives us insight into what was going on inside the Saddam Hussein regime and how avoidable miscalculation on both sides led to tragedy. Now out of government, Charles has recently headed a small entrepreneurial space launch company, which is fascinating, a different topic. He's a consultant and lecturer, and he's also, I'm proud to say, a former public policy scholar at the Wilson Center. Charles will lead off with opening remarks, giving his sort of laydown on this set of issues. Then he and I will have one or two rounds of questions between the two of us. Then we'll open it up for discussion on the floor. Charles, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rob, and thank everybody for coming out for lunchtime, and dozens more in the C-SPAN audience who are, like myself, have insomnia and turn to these programs. I'm going to break my remarks into three sections. I'll cover all three if I remember, but what I want to do is go through some of the background to how we got to where we are today, and that background has moved astonishingly fast. I want to talk a little bit about, perhaps lessons learned from Iraq and why I think the current challenge is a doable one, and then maybe highlight some of the risks lying ahead and how this may fit into other broader issues. It really is astonishing how fast this has proceeded. In last month, August 21st, there was this horrible chemical weapons attack in Syria. There were horrible videos about that, and this administration and other countries were, said, well, how are we going to react to that? A little over 2 weeks ago, on September 10th, the President of the United States had a prime-time television address to the nation, describing that this set of circumstances required military action. He was going to propose that to the Congress, but he felt that the principles that were broken by this use of chemical weapons needed to be responded to. He highlighted both the CWC, the Chemical Weapons Convention of the 90s, as well as the 1925 Geneva Protocol, which covered both chemical weapons and, in fact, BW. I would note that these are things which most Americans probably never heard of. And yet, it almost got to the point where it appeared in the Washington bubble that he was betting his presidency on taking a military course of action to address these two relatively obscure but important arms control agreements. That was on the 10th of September. Shortly thereafter, it became pretty clear, I think, and I'm not a political person, but that Congress was not really going to go along with that. So the administration, its position on Syria, and more particularly with its position on the narrow focus on Syrian chemical weapons, was really wobbly. Well, and in that speech, I would also point out that his criteria were twofold. One was to decay Syria's chemical weapons capability and to deter. These are the two elements that he set out as his objective for a military strike. And he always puts his fingers like this, as a very carefully targeted military strike. If he's going to do something big, I imagine he's just going to a really big military. No, but it was a very careful military strike with a limited but important objective: to deter and decay or degrade the Syrian capability. So what happened after that? The other point I would make is he linked it to very horrible videos, which struck me as interesting. I guess in the social media world, that's important these days, but it's risky because if there were a military strike, I think it's safe to say that the day after an American military strike, somebody would come up with unpleasant videos about the consequences of a military strike. So you wind up going down this path where policy is derived by competitive videos. In any case, what I'm trying to suggest here is there was a bit of a dodgy position that the United States had got itself into with respect to Syrian CW activities. Well, then along comes Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia. He proposed an astonishing idea. Can't we address this by using weapons inspectors, UN weapons inspectors? Now, there's two unique features about Sergei Lavrov. One, he spent 5 years as the Russian ambassador to the United Nations in the thick of the Iraqi problems. So he knew inside out. He knew all the politics, the debates, the arguments inside the Security Council, and he had a pretty good idea of the ins and outs of weapons inspectors, what they could do and what they could not do. And as things turned out, we, the weapons inspectors, did a better job than we even knew at the time in getting rid of the Iraqi chemical weapons, biologic weapons, and the rest of their inventory. But so Lavrov had that experience, but he also knows Syria. So he had those two pieces of data and experience and access, which would have allowed him, the United States couldn't do this, but he comes up with this idea, hey, what do you suppose we go down this weapons inspector route? Washington had the wisdom to say, this is not a bad idea. And I would also hasten to add that it didn't come completely out of the blue, this proposal from the Russians. There had been an ongoing dialogue, and there was an oblique reference to this in the Geneva statement. But there had been an ongoing dialogue between the staffs on dealing with chemical weapons. They'd met, I think, 5 times, if I'm correct on this. So it wasn't completely out of the blue, but certainly for Lavrov to inject this option at that point in time was important. And that kind of, I think, saved Washington from facing some very difficult decisions. What I would highlight about Lavrov's knowledge of Syria, though, is, he's a smart guy. He's a really smart guy. He's not a kind of a cuddly guy, but he's really smart. He would not be proposing something if he thought the Syrians were going to pull a fast one on him. So, he went into Geneva, my hypothesis is with pretty firm knowledge that at least for the first few steps, Syria is going to comply. I mean, imagine the circumstances or the dialogue between Lavrov and Bashar al-Assad. You know, what's in it for you, Bashar? So, you know, his regime is kind of wobbly. And the one thing that can help him would be a resurgence of his international legitimacy. So if you were to draw two lines, and I can imagine Lavrov doing this, said, you know, you guys in Damascus, you know, you need to do something that will sustain your international legitimacy while this assimilation, assembly of opponents, insurgents, their legitimacy will decay. And the best step you can take, and what we, the Russians, will support you on, is if you make a forward movement on this chemical weapons side, and you'll bolster your international legitimacy. That, to me, is a critical piece of all of this. What's in it for the Syrians? Unlike Iraq, the plus side, the positive incentive, was that they would get out of sanctions. That doesn't exist with respect to Bashar al-Assad right now. The plus for him is sustaining Russian support, building international legitimacy to the extent that they can, and hoping to outlast the cohesiveness of whatever passes for the insurgents. So only the Russians, and in particular Sergei Lavrov, could have done that. You know, I'm not standing here as a great fan of Sergei Lavrov. I was certainly on the receiving ends of a lot of his you know, spears in the Security Council in the 1990s, and he's more than happy to play around with some of the facts to suit him. I mean, I remember at one point, as the deputy chairman or the acting chairman of UNSCOM at a certain point, and UNSCOM had brought in samples of chemical agent into Baghdad to serve as reference materials for our laboratory that we had in our facility in Baghdad. And Lavrov, you know, would get up in the, you know, he was shocked and horrified that UNSCOM was bringing in chemical agent into Iraq. And, you know, who knows what we could do? We could be seeding the evidence and so forth. So he made a very elaborate and very, you know, weak case that, you know, UNSCOM was part of the problem, not part of the solution. So, you know, when I speak about Lavrov, and I seem to be quite, you know, positive on him, I'm only describing that he was in a position to take this step, not necessarily that he's, you know, the best person on the planet. I wouldn't be nominating him for the Nobel Peace Prize. But he is a pragmatist, and he would not be proposing something that he didn't think he could cause Syria to deliver on. A couple of other comments on the Geneva Agreement. The timeline on it is very fast, but again, doable. Some people compare this to Iraq and say, well, you know, you guys were, you know, faffing about on Iraq for a decade, and even then you didn't know what you're doing. Well, the fact is, in Iraq, we got most of the chemical weapons done in a period of probably 18 months. Now, we didn't know what 100% was, so we didn't know how much we did in those first few months, but it turns out it was the bulk of it. The mechanical process of doing this, it is feasible, so long as Syria cooperates. And this was a very key feature of what they agreed to in Geneva. Like the case of Iraq, they levied all of the heavy lifting, the obligations, the burden of proof was put on Syria. The role of the inspectors was critically limited to verifying what the Syrians say. And that dynamic was essential, and it was sustained and built in, beginning in the agreement in Geneva, and now in the draft resolution, which, as Rob mentioned, is intended to be passed tonight, and the implementing or the corresponding agreement that OPCW is going to have with their executive committee will also have that dynamic embedded in it. One other thing I would comment on in the Geneva discussion, you know, Lavrov and Kerry met, and in their statement they said they came to a common assessment of the Syrian chemical weapons holdings. That really jumped out at me because, you know, you have to imagine the American intelligence and Russian intelligence coming up, and they're saying, well, that's we kind of got about the same idea for what is in their inventories. Now that was vital because when the Syrians actually produced their declaration, it became pretty clear pretty quickly that it was in the ballpark. I mean, it hasn't been made public yet, although when it's passed around among the OPCW countries, I imagine it will be out public pretty quickly. But that declaration has been seen as being pretty thorough, pretty detailed. So that's a key first step. Lavrov would have had high confidence that they were going to do that, I think, in advance. There's been debate over whether the implementing resolution at the Security Council would be under Chapter 7 or Chapter 6. Now this, I may be disappearing into UN jargon here, but the shorthand for this is whether under Chapter 7 it implies a use of force. This was something that the Russians felt very strongly against, not just for the case of Syria, but because they feel strongly against that derivative of Kosovo and well, more recently even Libya and Iraq. The need, however, on the American side was that they needed to adjust some of the components of the OPCW practices. For example, and most obviously, the CWC prohibits the removal of chemical weapons from a country. Well, one of the most likely avenues for addressing the Syrian chemical weapons inventory problem is to take the stuff out for destruction. So there was some elements like that which had to be done in a resolution. As logic kind of played out, the Americans and Russians were able to balance their mutual interests, and they've got a draft resolution, which is again about to be passed. There were a couple of other aspects, technical aspects about how inspections are done. I'm thinking under OPCW, a country can refuse certain inspectors if they don't like them, or if they're from a country they don't like. That they don't want to give Syria that option. So there's a few things like that. But the messy part in all of this is the relationship between OPCW and the Security Council. That still isn't well wired as near as I can tell. You can think about this by simply asking yourself the question, well, who's in charge of all this? Who's the guy or the woman who's going to be the chief person on this Syrian activity? Is it the Director General of OPCW? I don't think so. Is it another individual who will report jointly to OPCW and the Security Council? Possibly. But that's, watch that space. Because I don't think it'll be just the Director General who's reporting to the Security Council every month on the teams of inspectors who go in, who will probably be mostly OPCW people or OPCW recruits, but not strictly them. And when I apologize for the jargon, OPCW is the implementing bureaucracy and inspectorate for the Chemical Weapons Convention. They're located in The Hague. Let me just mention a couple of things with respect to the lessons from Iraq. Syria in some ways is easier because it hasn't been blown up first. In the case of Iraq, when we went into Iraq in 1991 and 1992, all these military sites have been subjected to many, many weeks of bombing. Bunkers, depots, administrative buildings, all these places have been blowing up. So when you go in, you see a whole bunch of 122 millimeter rockets scattered about. You don't know if they're conventional, you don't know if they're chemical rounds. It's a lot more difficult to sort all that out. So from that standpoint, the Syrian case is somewhat easier. The other thing I would point out is in the case of Iraq, we operated what we called a chemical destruction group for 2 years, from 1992 to 1994, where the weapons inspectors supervised the destruction of chemical agents and chemical munitions. We destroyed, I think it was 38,000 munitions, something like close to 700 tons of bulk agent, that is, sarin and mustard that hadn't been put into munitions, and a lot more of precursors. The Iraqis operated under our supervision an incinerator and a hydrolysis plant. These were facilities which the Iraqis constructed, or in the case of the hydrolysis plant, it was a pre-existing facility that was kind of redialed for destruction of sarin as opposed to the creation of sarin. It wasn't that hard, and it did not take that many people. The risk that people point to with respect to Syria's security, but the wisdom, I think, of the resolution and the agreement in Geneva was that burden is put on the government of Syria. And I think logically, as difficult as it is, it's still going to be logical for the Syrians will have their most sensitive weapons at places that they can consider to be secure. If you believe the reports in the press, the American and other intelligence agencies think the Syrians have been moving stuff. So they've, that's good and bad. It's good in the sense that they've got experience moving this stuff, and when they're required to consolidate it at certain locations, they can do that. It's bad because you may wonder, well, are they moving stuff around to avoid inspections or so on and so forth? But the safety of the inspectors, it's probably the most difficult part of this. But again, if the burden for that is put onto the Syrians, I think there's a logical path ahead where if it turns out there's 45 sites that they need to inspect, they can design a sequence to get to those sites, transportation either by ground with security there, or potentially by helicopters, although if you use aircraft, you have to worry about man pads, the anti-aircraft things which insurgents may have. The biggest risk I see going forward is that we will be putting a spotlight on a lot of facilities, and there's a lot of people fighting in Syria who will have an interest in this going badly wrong, and they become targets. So that to me, if I'm thinking ahead, would be the largest risk that I could see, that some insurgent group decides it's in their interest to cause casualties or to cause problems in this. But I return to the point where I started, which was recalling what the president laid out in his speech for a military strike, which was to deter and degrade the Syrian chemical weapons capability. I feel pretty strongly that the path that we're on has a much higher probability of much greater success in terms of deterring and degrading Syrian CW than if we'd done this with a military strike. One other just comment on how they'll lay out, how the weapons inspectors will lay out their priorities and objectives. There are some easy things which you can do which will hobble the CW program quickly. You can go after and destroy production and filling equipment, for example, very quickly. You can go after the components of sarin, like alcohol, and someone has, you just pour that out on the ground, and you're taking away a key component. So there are things which you can do quickly, early on, which will hobble it and control the CW program. The harder things can be managed by putting them under international security quickly, international locks, seals, and then when the international community can figure out a way of getting people to accept either bulk agent or munitions for destruction, this can be done, I think. I'm going to stop there. Take questions, or
Why don't you
okay.
take them from the table here. Thank you, Charles. That was really kind of an excellent kind of overview of the issue. Let me probe one or two issues before we open it up to the floor, and begin with sort of really the operational question of where we're at right now. Picking up on your on the description of your experience in Iraq and the contrasts, with Syria, the agreement that Lavrov and Kerry worked out, and which is being translated into Security Council resolution format, lays out 3 phases, the first of which was accomplished to some degree of satisfaction, namely the declaration of inventory by the Syrians. That's some question about that, but the fact that, as you mentioned, the Russians and the United States are on the same page on what the stocks are is encouraging. The second phase, which we're heading into, is, and which is on a really short timeline, November is the target date, is for the destruction of equipment for producing, mixing, and filling chemical munitions, to be followed by the complete elimination first half of 14, which everyone views as a very kind of ambitious timeline. But as you point out, UNSCOM actually got a lot done, you know, not over the whole decade, really in the first 18 months or so. But to this point, in this second phase that we're entering into, the focus on equipment for producing, is it your judgment that if key precursors are identified and the key equipment for kind of weaponization, and there was a report in the press that a lot of the Iraqi materials are in non-weaponized form, that if that phase goes well, that we will be substantially, you know, further in the goal of preventing further Syrian CW use?
The short answer is yes. I mean, the way it breaks down, they're going to have people hitting the ground for this purpose starting, I think, Sunday or Monday. Their first step is to do a baseline survey of, I believe it's 45 declared sites. So these inspectors will be going out to each of these sites to say, okay, what's where? That's kind of the first half of this, of what you're talking about, which is in a 30-day period. This is all supposed to happen in October. Then, exactly as you said, they're going to identify key pieces which they can destroy right here and now. There's things, you know, for making sarin, you know, you have these things called glass-lined reactor vessels that are specialized for this type of. They'll just go out and run it over with a you know, a tractor. So they can do a lot of very quick and early destruction, which will, you know, I keep using the word hobble, but will really, you know, take the Syrian program offline. Where I think you're headed on this, so is, you know, getting that material balance. Is if they declare they had, you know, X number of munitions and X number of gallons of sarin and mustard, you know, on hand, you know, can they account for all of that, make it all add up? If they visit all of the bunkers, you know, does this kind of add up? You know, that's a lot to do in a month. Moreover, to request that the Syrians consolidate that once they have, you know, a record keeping of what's where, when they want it consolidated in certain bunkers, you know, that's a lot to do in a month. But, you know, as a practical matter, you know, if everybody's working with, you know, with success in mind, if it takes longer, I think people will be understanding. It will be key who heads the UN effort, and it will be key who the counterpart is. If the Syrians name somebody who's, you know, very good, you know, and has a good relationship with the counterpart, you know, a lot of the problems, which are inevitable, will be sorted out on the ground. In the case of Iraq, you know, we went down a path where we got to a point where the track record was, these guys are always going to lie. So we weren't excusing them. Somebody said, well, we forgot the key to get into the warehouse. We weren't buying that. But it may well be that the guy forgot the key. And, you know, so there's a lot of stuff which happens on the ground which, you know, never makes it back to the Security Council, and personalities are important.
Thank you. Just moving from the operational issues, I'm sure some of the audience here, you know, will want to probe even further on that. Let me turn to sort of two kind of political military issues that kind of really going to flow from the Syria case, and for which the history of Iraq, you know, bears importantly and has implications for dealing with future cases. In your remarks, you mentioned that that the accord, in a way, kind of legitimizes the Assad regime as the repository of Syria's chemical weapons, and in so doing, one of the criticisms of this whole process has been that it's sort of bolstering potentially the Syrian regime, and at a time when the U.S. objective is Assad must go. So there's been this tension, as there was in the Iraq case, between compliance and regime change. In the case of Libya, where there were chemical weapons that were in the process of being kind of eliminated after the 2003 kind of breakthrough, WMD breakthrough with Libya, even in the middle of the Libyan civil war leading to Gaddafi's overthrow, the U.S. government said that Gaddafi was responsible for these chemical weapons and would be held accountable, you know, for use. And you see a similar thing with Syria, of holding the Assad kind of regime accountable. Syria, just interesting historical footnote, was never considered a rogue state in the 1990s because, as sort of a politically malleable concept, Syria was needed for the then Arab-Israeli peace process. So the Clinton administration, unlike Iraq and Libya, North Korea, and Iran, did not designate Syria as a rogue state. But the question for you is, like, if you're from the policy side, how does the Obama administration manage this tension between kind of compliance and regime change?
Well, in the resolution, the draft resolution, which is meant to be passed today, there is reference to the Geneva Conference on future of Syria. And the language in that, it's in the same resolution as the one talking about the chemical weapons thing. So you're onto exactly one of the rubs, which dealing with Syria, you've got the same problem with Iraq. I mean, Iraq used to come to me in the 90s and said, listen, hey, if we really make you guys happy, that is the weapons inspectors, will Washington really agree to lift the sanctions? Logical question from Saddam. And the only answer I was able to give him was, well, there's one way to find out, which got me off the hook. But it's exactly this tension. For Bashar al-Assad, I mean, he evidently has been convinced that his best, perhaps only route to, surviving is by proceeding down this path on the chemical weapons. But over time, dealing with that regime, you de facto are conveying some legitimacy to it. I would hasten to add, though, is, as awkward as that may be in some ways, it's still better than a military strike. Because if we had done a military strike, then you lift the burden of responsibility for all these chemical weapons, which we're concerned about, from the Bashar al-Assad regime. So you keep him as the button, and you tie the responsibility to him through this process. The sorting out the political stuff, that's going to be a mess. But it's even worse than what you're suggesting, because the whole region is a mess, which I don't think anybody can fully understand. The ability to focus on at least one narrow part, which is kind of understandable, Syrian chemical weapons, I think is not a bad thing. But it's not going to solve, any of the other knock-on things in, Iran or Jordan, going upside down and all these other issues.
Last point before we kind of open it up to the floor. And your last comment really kind of leads to this line of questioning. One of the lessons of the Syrian crisis, now only 2 weeks, 3 weeks old, was that the credible threat of force had bolstered diplomacy. Now, you had written during that period about the problematic option of the use of force, that the use of force to kind of degrade and deter the Assad regime's ability to use chemical weapons could also undermine their ability to control weapons. And I think that not to be kind of developed at length at this meeting, but potentially kind of a subject for a future meeting of MEP, is sort of like whether there is sort of this credible threat of force in dealing, as many point in the Iranian case, when even in the Syrian case, it just looks inherently kind of problematic of kind of environmental consequences of striking hot sites, undermining the regime's ability to control it. But I think that the Syria case really is being looked to with one eye toward what are its implications on the integration of force and diplomacy leading with Iran. My own view is it's inherently problematic, but this seems to be where the debate is right now, and I'd be interested in your comment on that.
Well, I don't know what the target set was that they were talking about for this little military strike, but I know in the case of Iraq, they talk about a military strike, but the poor guys over in the Pentagon who actually had to, line up weapons on targets said, what do you want us to blow up? And it became a hard thing to do. Mm-hmm. And, for exactly the reason, if you blow up the command and control, which sounds like a good thing to do, do you really want to do that? Don't you then increase the odds of the nightmare scenario where this stuff gets out into everybody's hands? And it is, I'm a little bit reluctant to say this, but it's not necessarily the case that only Syria has access to chemical weapons. I mean, the Lavrov argument that potentially the insurgents had access, he's not going to say something which is completely incredible. He may actually, there may be some parts of that there could be some truth to. I mean, there was a recent, Aki Selstrom, the fellow who did the recent UN inspection, and he reported to the Secretary General without laying blame as to who did this. You know, he put in a lot of data in his annex about the munitions that were used. They're not real sophisticated munitions. And it would be very interesting to see if those munitions are in the Syrian declaration. I wouldn't be surprised if they were not. Now, you can spin out all kinds of hypotheses about this, and whether it was the IRGC who was providing assistance and this and that. It can get real murky very quickly. And I wouldn't want to get diverted onto that. But, you know, when you get on the ground in these circumstances, things aren't as clear as they might appear to be in Washington.
Let's open it up now for comments and preferably questions from the floor. And Hales van Diari, there's a microphone coming to you.
Thank you very much. How many other countries in the region have chemical weapons, as far as you know? That's one question. And really, if one wanted to destroy all the chemical weapons that Syria, if one wanted to destroy all the chemical weapons that Syria has, how long will it take, really? Is 2 months, 4 months, 6 months?
Well, the deadline which they wrote out to address the second question first was by the middle of roughly 2014. And as a practical matter, you know, once they consolidate these things at locations and have them under international supervision, I think that's the hard part. Then are you going to get rid of them in Syria, destroy them, incinerate them, whatever there, or are you going to take them to another country? And frankly, I think that's the more likely route. How that in fact plays out over time, I don't know. But I think they could probably meet their deadline by the middle of 2014 of getting, you know, the agent, bulk agent, and, you know, loaded munitions. You know, the Russians have a nice base on the seaside, so use it. And the Russians have in fact volunteered to do some of this destruction. So I'm not that worried about the timeline. I think the first key phrase, what Rob was referring to in the first month, identifying this stuff, going out and consolidating it, and getting under the lock and key, if that can be done in the next 3 months, then I think, you know, we're in much better shape. On the first part of your question, the short answer, I don't really know. I mean, the glib response, which we used to make it in Iraq, was if they were successful in Iraq, Iraq might be the only country in the region without weapons of mass destruction. That's too glib. But I mean, the supposition is that other countries in the region do, but I don't know really what they are. And they certainly, I think they've lost their appeal. Where I thought you might be asking was about biological weapons, and that's really a big if. Bashar al-Assad, I forget which interview, but he made reference to the point that he still has the ability to deter Israel. And I don't know what exactly he was referring to there. But this is a little bit off. You imagine the enormity of him telling his bureaucracy, you know, all the people who are largely invested in this chemical weapons deterrent, which he's had for decades, said, guys, let's get rid of it. That's a pretty big step. I wouldn't trivialize that. He's got to, you know, and it may not make him more secure domestically.
This gentleman, if speakers could please identify themselves.
Charles, I'm Will Embry. I work for DynCorp International now, but more to the point, I worked on these issues at State when you were in UNSCOM. And I want to first note how incredibly successful UNSCOM was in finding and destroying WMD when they were there. But I'd like to go back dig a little further into this removal issue. In Iraq, we talked about that, but couldn't figure out, as I remember, a way to get the CW out of the country to a destruction facility. What are the? Do you think it's practical to move the CW, the munitions, out of the country? What are going to be the paths to get it out, or do you think that they're going to destroy them there, which I think will be slower and more difficult?
First, I suppose I should apologize for being such a nuisance, because when we were in UNSCOM, I know everybody at the State Department hated us because we had all kinds of great ideas that, but you're correct. I mean, it's not easy. I mean, if the Americans were going to destroy CW, it would cost billions and billions of dollars. In the case of Iraq, we caused the Iraqis to build an incinerator and to modify equipment which existed there, and we destroyed in situ, an inventory roughly the size of Syria for about $10 million. Now, be advised, I mean, that was at a period of time before the CWC was passed. There was no OSHA, and we did this. I mean, we did it safely, but we were able to do it, in that environment. I will be interested to see in the Syrian declaration if they've got destruction capability, which they declare. I kind of thought they might, because if you've got chemical weapons for several decades in your inventory, I mean, they're not like Wonder Bread. They don't last forever. There's a best if used by date. So you've got to do something with the stuff that you made in 1970 in 1990 or something. So I would look for in their destruction. They may have internally some destruction capability, but if they don't, the weapons inspector will very quickly make a decision. Is it better to reconfigure equipment which is there for destruction, or can we get some group of international countries to accept delivery of that? And getting it out, I don't think will be that hard. I recognize that there's an insurgency going on, but again, the Syrians have been moving this stuff around pretty regularly for the last 3 or 4 years.
Hi, Darrell Kimball, Arms Control Association. Thanks, Charles, for your great overview and your excellent work. There's one question that you didn't address that I wanted to ask you about, which you should have particular expertise about, given that you were on the ground in Iraq and you understand how many people it takes, how many teams. One of my concerns here is the OPCW's ability, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, ability to send qualified people in for the inspection and the destruction oversight in this short time frame. They have about 125 inspectors today. They've got ongoing responsibilities with the Chemical Weapons Convention. So it seems to me that this is going to take additional resources for the OPCW, additional personnel that have to be seconded from other governments, and done very rapidly. How many people would you roughly estimate this job, based upon what we know so far about the task, might be involved? How quickly can the OPCW, with assistance from the U.S., Europe, Russia, pull in the best qualified people to get this tough job done? And I agree with you that this is difficult but doable, but this seems to be one of the toughest aspects of getting it done.
Darrell, those are great points to focus on. I want to refer and give a plug to the Norwegian government, because a couple of years ago, their foreign ministry funded a study to say, hey, all these old doddering UNSCOM inspectors are all going to drop dead. And, shouldn't we kind of record what they did? Because who knows, it might happen again. And they made a recommendation. They drafted a whole kind of a how-to book, which turns out to have been very useful in the Syrian case. But on exactly this point, said, wouldn't it be useful to have a trained cadre of weapons inspectors that you could surge when a circumstance just like exists today happens? On the numbers specifically, OPCW they do have limited people. My back of the envelope calculation would be they probably need 75 people. Here's my arithmetic. They need a headquarters element in Damascus. There's a motor pool. You got to have guys that run a motor pool. There's going to be lab guys. There's got to be guys who handle and secure the samples that are taken. If there's 45 sites and you have to cover them in a month, if you do maybe a site and a half a day, I mean, if you got a bunker with thousands of rounds, it takes a while to go through all that. So maybe you have 3 or 4 teams the inspection team. And that team would probably be 15 people. So that's going to be, I don't know, 4 SUVs. Because, when you put on all this, Darth Vader stuff, you take up a lot of space in a car. There's a lot of equipment. I mean, I'm being a little bit glib, but, it's not, you can't just get 3 guys in a truck and drive off to a site. There's a lot of stuff you have to bring. There's security, there's med, you've got to have comms. There's a lot of infrastructure that you have to bring along. But I would guess on the order of 75. And it will be tough to get that many experts. But they're not all chemical weapons experts. Some of them, you've got comms guys, you've got operations officers who can, get, that you're herding cats with some of these, these scientist types. They say, okay, you get in the front car, you get in this car, you get in this car. You need somebody who's got glue all that together. But, if they can do it. And again, this is important for the U.S. and the Russians to kind of agree on a roster. And I understand there's some rosters floating around. There's a lot of UNSCOM alumni that are out there, and if you they'd be willing to do this again. But you're exactly right there on having the right people.
Time for one more question. Yes, Greg.
Greg Thielman, also of the Arms Control Association. I have a question, Charlie, about Iran. Iran has been providing both financial help, military supplies, even combatants to the Assad government. Do you have any speculation on how Iran is going to play in this CW destruction? Are they going to be supportive? I mean, you have a Iranian nation that finds chemical weapons rather repulsive. How is this going to work with Iran?
That's a really good question, Greg, and Hala and I were talking about this just before the session. I mean, Iran has addressed this, and he's publicly said how terrible he finds, chemical weapons, and it's important to him to get rid of it. On the other hand, what is the IRGC doing? They can make a lot of mischief if it suits them. So I don't really know. I mean, it's something to keep an eye on. I would narrowly defined my task to getting rid of Syrian CW, and somebody else can worry about the Iranian stuff. But I thought maybe you were going to head to, well, how are you going to, support it with intelligence and so on and so forth. And, that too can be worked out, I think. I mean, you can imagine, when we were doing this in Iraq, we had a U-2, which was, flown at our behest. Now that you could have, UAVs or something, and perhaps keep an eye on what other groups are doing. But that will be, the head of this outfit, whoever it is going to have to determine how much information he or she wants to receive from outside countries that will tell him about security issues. Are there insurgents in the area? Are there things moving in different ways? I don't know. It's a tough question. I don't have an answer for it.
Well, I think we've been treated to an excellent presentation today on a really thorny, complex set of issues. Thank you all for attending today, those viewing by C-SPAN, and please join me in thanking Charles Duelfer for a superb presentation today.